Hello and welcome to Module 3 of the Perl workshop. In this module we'll be talking about if statements. The idea behind an if statement is that you want to be able to control the flow of your program. You want to stop and say, if my data is this, then do this. If it's not this, then do something else. And so that's the basic idea. And the basic structure of an if statement is here. I have it in comments. So again, you can download this. This is called lesson3.perl. And you can download it from the link below the video. So the basic structure of an if statement is this. You say if, and then inside of here is a Boolean statement. Now a Boolean statement can either be true or it can be false. So if this statement in here is true, then do something. And those will be encapsulated with curly brackets. Else, do something else. So if it's this, do this. If it's not, then do this. So it's pretty straightforward. Now, so if you're not familiar with Boolean statements, don't worry, we'll go over those first. Some basic Boolean operations are here. I've written them here for numerical values. You can check if two values are equal to each other. So you can say if x equals y, then do something. And here notice it's two equal signs. For those of you who are unfamiliar with programming, this is pretty standard. So instead of, for the single equal, it's reserved for assignment when we're assigning a value to a variable, but a double equal will actually check for equality. So you can check if things are equal to each other. You can check if things are not equal to each other with a bang equal. And you can do greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. So those are the basic Boolean operations for numerical values. For strings, which we talked a lot about last time, it's a little bit different. To check if two strings are equal, you do not use the equal. You will use EQ, which is a keyword. It's reserved for Perl to check for string equality. And if they're not equal to each other, then you can use not equal. There are other Boolean operations for strings, but we'll just stick with these. These should be good enough for our purposes. So let's start talking about it. If you notice, I skipped over this note, but I'll go back and touch on it, and you'll see in a minute why this is the case, hopefully. So you can have an if statement without an else. So you can say, if this, then do this. You don't necessarily have to say, if it's not that, then do something else. But you can't, of course, have an else without an if. That should make sense, and as we go through, it should make more sense to you. So let's get started. So let's look at just a simple few if statements. So this first one, I've set x equal to 0, y equal to 10. And one thing that I don't know if I completely made clear in my last videos, every statement that you make in Perl needs, as long as if it's not a comment, it needs to have a semicolon after it. If you're declaring things, because when you're using if statements, you'll see that you don't put a semicolon after the if statement like this. This won't work. You just leave it in a line like this, and you use curly brackets to list the commands that you want it to do inside of here. So semicolons for statements, single statements, if statements are different. And you'll get more used to this as we go on. So I have set x and y equal to something. Now I want to check and see if they're equal to each other, and if they are, I want to print that they're the same. If not, I want to print that they're not the same. So obviously we expect here that we'll get x and y are not the same. So if we run it, I'm in my Mac environment now. In my previous few videos, I've been in my Linux side, my virtual box, but today I decided to do it on Mac just to show the different environment, and I'm still using the same IDE, Geany, however you want to say it. So I just wanted to show it in Mac as well. So that's why, so in Linux, Perl, when you execute something, it's a lowercase p, and in Mac, it's an uppercase p. So for those of you using a Mac, just an FYI. Okay, so Perl, or lesson 3. Okay, so we do get x and y are not the same. They're not the same. So this is what we expected and this is what we got. Now the other thing that you see printing out is this next if statement, and it's about the same thing. I have two strings now, hello and goodbye, and I check to see if they're equal, and of course they're not, and so I print, so they print they're not the same. So I can show you, so a lot of people when they first start learning Perl, they see equal equal and they try to use it for everything. But I'll show you that this will not work. So if I change this to equal equal instead of EQ for strings, I'll show you. It thinks now that string 1 and string 2 are the same. So we want to be careful about that. We want to make sure that we use EQ for strings and equal equal for variables. So that's the basic of an if statement. Now we're going to get a little bit more fancy with them as we go on. So the next part in this, I want to touch on nested if statements. So I'm going to comment this section out like so. Now I'm going to move into this one and uncomment this block. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is nested if statements. So nested if statements are if statements inside of if statements. And I'm going to go through exactly what I mean by that. So here I have test, which is a string. I've given it the string hello. And I found the length of it. We discussed this last time. Finding the length of a string is just the length function here, and you pass in the string. And now I'm going to test the string. I'm going to test the length of the string. So if my string is not, the length of my string is not 0, so there's something in my string, I want to come in and do this statement. Now, so this statement before, if we look in our commented one, was just a single print statement. But there's no reason why it can't be another if statement. So now I'm inside of this, because hello is clearly greater than 0 in length. And now I want to say if my test length is less than 10, then the length of test is between 1 and 9. And if not, then I want to say that the length of test is greater than 9. Now, of course, this original if statement has an else. So if, and it's really important when you're coding to keep your indentation correct. So what I mean by that is I have these two if statements that clearly go together. If this if and else, they clearly go together and they're on the same line. Same here. So these two if and else statements go together and they're on the same line. So it makes it cleaner to read and it makes your code more understandable. So going back to summarize, we have if my length of my string is not equal to 0, we come in here and we execute this if statement. Else, then we'll just say the length is 0. So if it's not equal to 0, then it must be equal to 0. Or sorry, if it doesn't pass this test, if this is false, then it's 0. So then we print out 0. And we can see that, so this should be 5. So let's see what we get. Perl lesson 3.perl. And we get that the length of test is between 1 and 9. Now if I change it, and I change it to hello goodbye, and I run it again, I will get that the length of test is greater than 9. And if I make it an empty string, save it, I will get that the length of test is 0. So that's one thing that's really helpful to do when you're first learning to code or anything, is just to test things out, change it up, see what it does, just poke at it until you really understand what is happening. Okay, so I'm going to put hello back in there. So so that ends part 2. Part 3, we're going to look at a little bit more complicated Boolean statements. So let me comment this out. And we're going to come in here. And uncomment these lines. Okay, so for those of you who have done a little bit of programming, you probably know about this. For the rest of you, it should be something that logically makes sense. So you can concatenate two Boolean statements together by using and or. So for instance, let's go through my first example just to illustrate this. So I have my test string again, and it's equal to hello, and I find my length, which we know will be 5. So I can say if my test length is not equal to 0, so that's what I had done before, so I'm checking to see if it's an empty string, and my test length is less than 10, then I can print that the length of test is between 1 and 9. And my else statement, so I know that it is either the case that, so one of these must be false, so the length of test is either 0 or greater than 9. So for an and statement like this, both sides of the and need to be true for this if statement to execute and to go inside and print out this statement. So the other one that I mentioned is or. And so instead of and here, you can concatenate it with or. And so now, if either one of these on either side is true, then this statement will be executed. So if either test is the empty string, it's equal to 0, the length is 0, or it's greater than 10, then inside of here will be executed. So those are the two options that you have. So if we read it through, in this case, test length will be 5, and that's not equal to 0, and it's less than 10, so we should get this statement. So down here, I have another one. So now this one is numerical. This may show it a little bit better. So x is equal to 10 and y is equal to 20. So now I just check to see, if x truly equals 10 and y equals 20, then I'll just print, oh, well, a little misleading. So I'll print out either these two statements. So obviously this is going to come back and it's going to print here because we know that x is equal to 10 and we know that y is equal to 20. Now down here, we're looking to see if either x or y is equal to 0. Now this is not the case for either of them, so we should come into this else statement and print this statement. So let's see if our assumptions are correct. And that is what we were expecting. So we have that x is equal, or we have the length of test is between 1 and 9. So that was our first if statement. And that one was 5, so we knew that that was going to print. And now we have that x is 0 and y is 10. Oh, I must not have saved this. So always save before you execute. Here we go. So I'm going to clear my screen. Oops, not again. There we go. So x is equal to 10 and y is equal to 20. And now we're checking that if they're 0, if either one of them is 0, and they're not, so we get this else statement. So play around with these if statements and see until you can fully understand them and see what you can do. There, I think, is one more big part that I want to touch on, and then we'll have an exercise at the end where we'll do something a little bit more interesting maybe to some of you. Let me comment these. All right, so part 4, the if or the else if statement. Okay, uncomment. Okay, so else if is kind of a way of cascading, of creating a cascading if statement. So you want to check for multiple conditions. You don't just want to look for if this, then do this, or do that. You want to look for if it's this, do this. If it's this, then do this. If it's this other thing, then do this. If it's this other thing, and so on and so forth, until you run out of the cases that you have. Okay, so here's a simple statement. X is equal to 20. So I say if x is equal to 0, then print out it's equal to 0. If it's 10, print it out 10. And so this can go so on and so forth. So we know x is equal to 20. So we should hit this one. So this is the basic structure. If you first is going to be an if. Any following if statements, that any other conditions you want to test for, specific conditions that you want to test for, will be in an else if, like this. And they look like an if statement. And then you'll have your final else, that none of your conditions you wanted to test for were correct or were true. So then you just print out a generic default answer. Okay, so we pretty sure we're going to get this one. Let's see if that's the case. It's true. So we get this statement. And again, you can build infinitely complicated logic into these if you have an application that needs complicated Boolean statements. Okay, so now we're going to do an exercise that will illustrate the difference between, hopefully the difference between some of these if statements in the nested if statements and the if-else statements. We comment these. All right. Oops. Uncomment. All right. So in this exercise, we'll be looking for motifs in a sequence of nucleotides. So we have our nucleotides here called in a variable called str, and we have our two motifs. Now, if we look manually at this string, we'll notice that both of our motifs are in fact inside the, so here's our first motif, it's there, and our second motif is here. So we have these two motifs, so we should be able to find them. So if you remember back to the previous lesson, how we can do that, an easy way is by using the index function. And the index function will give us the position in which we find a search string in our main string. So we give it our search or our main string and our search string. And so I've saved the indices for motif 1 and motif 2 in str. So if we don't find the motif, the index function will give us back a -1. So the way that I've written this logic is that, so if we have if we have found the first motif, if it's not equal to -1, and it's in there, then we want to print out that where the motif is located. Else if, we have motif 2 not equal to -1, we want to print where motif 2 is. And else, finally, we don't find either motif and we just print out that they're not found. So a lot of people make the mistake that this would be the way to do this. It's not. There's a logical error with this, and we can see it. So let's run it and let's see. So we have already visually confirmed that both of these motifs are in here, so we may expect to see both of these if statements or both of these print statements executed. So let's give that a try. Oh, well, darn. I already had the other, the correct way of doing it already uncommented down below. So I'm just going to talk through, and so this is the output from the first one, from this chunk here. And it just prints out this first if statement. this first if statement. If you have if else's, this is really important to remember. If you're doing if and else ifs, as soon as it finds a condition that is true, it's going to print it and it's going to kick out of the chunk. It's not going to go any farther. As soon as it finds something that it satisfies, a condition it satisfies, it's going to execute what's inside of those curly brackets, and it's not going to do any of the other else if statements. So this is not, if you want to look for both of your motifs, this is not the way to do it. Now, you could think about doing it in a nested way, but I think that would get ugly because you'd have to first look and see if there would be 4 different conditions to check for. You'd have to check to see if both the motifs are there, if just motif 1 is there and motif 2 is not, if motif 2 is there and motif 1 is not, or if both of them are not there. So it could get a little bit fishy. So sometimes the easiest way of doing it is the way you should go, and that is 2 separate if-else statements. Simple enough. So in this if statement, I check for motif 1, and in this if-else statement, I check for motif 2. And you can see from the previous execution that it does in fact find the right indices, and it finds the 2 motifs. So the first motif, as we recall, started at index 0, and the second motif started at index 1. So it's a quick little exercise to show something, the if statements in action. We're going to be using the if statements in the next module. The next module we'll be talking about for loops and while loops. And I hope to see you there. Please comment below and ask your questions, or ask if you want to ask for a specific thing to be done, a specific video to be recorded about Perl. Go ahead and ask that down below, and I'll get to it, or I'll answer your question directly, and we can go from there. Okay, see you next time.